So I think that's like a great transition into our next question, which deals with Paul and his co-authors and their writing their letter to the Thessalonians. In your work, you talk about Paul and the co-authors using certain words about themselves that would be very unusual in their time period. Can I just read a section of your work here?
Sure.
You say that certain scholars define trophos as referring to a person who functions as a substitute for a mother in the process of rearing children. The term is to be differentiated from titi or titi, wet nurse. Now, you're saying that trophos or trophos is used by Paul and the co-authors to talk about themselves in their letter to the Thessalonians. Can you discuss why that is the case? Or could you, I guess, discuss what is significant about their using that term?
Yes, I think what's significant in Paul's use of it and is the fact that obviously Paul, as a male, is adopting a feminine term to describe himself and his co-authors in relation to the Thessalonian community. And again, it is a metaphor that he's employing there, but the metaphor is significant because it's making a statement about how Paul wants to position himself and his co-authors in relation to the Thessalonian brothers. I think what's important here is that most readers of the New Testament won't always fully appreciate that the text is, for the most part, addressed to males, as in the brothers, the Thessalonian brothers. Obviously, there's presence of females in the New Testament texts themselves, but what is important to note is that the text, which is sometimes obscured by some sort of more contemporary translations, gender-neutral translations specifically, that try to say, the brothers and the sisters in Thessalonica, or in Galatia or wherever. But I think what we sometimes miss is that there is a predominance of maleness within these texts. And when Paul addresses himself to the Thessalonian brothers, he and adopts this feminine image to describe himself and his co-authors, we have to ask ourselves the question: what is the rhetorical force of that metaphor? And what is Paul trying to achieve by adopting a feminine image to depict himself and his co-authors in relation to the Thessalonian brothers? What does that say about the Thessalonian brothers, and what does that say about Paul and the co-authors in that sort of relational dynamic? And I think what I try to do in the book is explore that idea and propose that, together with another term that Paul uses in 1 Thessalonians, that of infant, which is a little bit contested, because most English translations prefer to translate the word as gentle, and so I'm kind of going for a minority reading on a particular Greek word, and so Paul describes himself as gentle and as this nurse, this nurturing, feminine, child-rearing, caring individual in relation to the Thessalonian brothers, and so I try to wrestle with what that actually means for our readings today as well. So
you use the word brothers there. Is there anything more you want to talk about with Paul and the use of brothers in the text?
For me, it is a fairly important point to draw attention to, because I think most readers wouldn't pay any attention to that. They're either happy to take on the translations that are not gender inclusive, mm-hmm. and so it will usually just talk about the brethren or the brothers, or they're happy to take the gender neutral translations, but then those obscure the fact that these texts were still written within a very patriarchal, masculine culture. And I think that shouldn't be lost sight of, because it makes the image of Paul as a trophos all the more striking.
All right, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, in light of that, though, we also, I think we've talked about this privately. I'm not sure how much you talk about it in your book, as far as I can remember. It might be in there. But Paul is using, and his co authors are using trophos to describe themselves.
Mm.
But there are also times in the New Testament that Paul is using very masculine, almost Roman ideals, and perhaps there are definitely Roman ideals in there,
Yeah.
to describe relationships, to describe hierarchies, even describe himself. So,
Yeah.
can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, I think what's important to understand about Paul within the context of Roman imperial ideology is that he can occupy two positions simultaneously. He can be both seeking to subvert the Roman Empire with the way in which he talks about the gospel as literally a subversion of the Roman gospel, but at the same time, being influenced by that Roman imperial ideology, Paul can also play into the hands of that ideology. And I think what we, I think we're always in we're always at risk of either painting Paul in a very flat way, where he's either totally and utterly against the Roman Empire, or he's pretty much in support of whichever government happens to be in power at the time. So kind of thinking Romans 13 here. So I think when we read Paul's letters carefully and we read them closely, what becomes immediately obvious is that in some instances, Paul is playing into the hands of Roman thinking, and can very much reinforce particular Roman ideals about masculinity, and in fact project himself as the quintessential male in that sort of way of thinking. But then we also have these examples that work against that. So he can identify with being an oppressed Jew under the Roman Empire, but he can also identify with trying to mimic some of the thinking of the Roman Empire. And I think that's exactly why adopting a post-colonial biblical critical approach to the text highlights the complexity of the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, in the sense that that relationship always plays out in very complex ways. So those who are colonized are in many ways forced to adopt the ways of thinking, doing, and behaving of the colonizer. And in this context, we're talking about the Romans colonizing the then world and enforcing a way of thinking and of behaving, which gets adopted into the very bodies of the colonized individuals. And I think this also becomes a very important thing, that Paul's body is a body that is shaped by Roman imperial thinking, but his body is also a Jewish body, and that body is therefore also shaped by Jewish ways of thinking. But we also got the influence of Hellenism. And so the complexities of those influencing factors on shaping Paul mean that sometimes when we're reading his letters, they can go one way or the other. And I think we just need to pay attention to that. I know that sometimes makes things a little bit more complicated in terms of interpretation, but I think if we are to be faithful to what the text is saying, then we have to wrestle and anticipate that we're going to have in a sense, a very contradictory sort of way of understanding Paul.